Welcome to the subject operating systems, the topic open source software. It is true that any software can be developed using this idea of open source. The focus for this topic is operating systems. We want to see how the open source model is used to develop operating systems. The idea of open source has happened in a very dramatic manner with Linus Torvalds from Finland writing up a simple mail saying that he is having some degree of difficulty in coding the internals of an operating system using a specific hardware. There were a lot of people who knew, but then since this query came, they started responding saying that this is how we should be able to solve. Almost the first well documented case of seeking help for writing a piece of software on a system that is available within the organization where Linus Torvalds was doing his work, and a lot of people started contributing saying that this is how this particular problem can be solved, this is how you can solve this. For once, a development idea moved outside the boundaries of a given organization, a given system, a lot of responses came. Gradually the idea developed and Linus Torvalds started involving more and more people who can volunteer to build further. Had a great idea, and of course the forerunner for this is what Andrew Tannenbaum and his research laboratory people have built as Minix. It is a textbook material. Minix was always developed as something which is a toned down version of a huge Unix operating system which was very successful. One of the most successful development ideas in software is still called Unix today. 1971 it became commercial. A nicely toned down an academic version of Unix was called Minix. Andrew Tannenbaum and his research scholars in his research laboratory have built up the Minix operating system. Linus Torvalds did something which is like this, saying that people from anywhere can volunteer to tell what is it that can happen, how to build it, and gradually what he did was he started building a core, a kernel, which began the exercise of involving million volunteers all over the globe to see how it can be developed with a little bit of structuring, with a little bit of interrupting here and there interventions. It became a full operating system called Linux, and it became an open source software. Anybody can read the code. There is no concern about what is happening in terms of the operating system execution. We can have a build, we can have versions. So Linus Torvalds created this method of involving volunteers outside of the operating system, no sense of ownership to the physical hardware or confines to a given country or given region. If you are good enough in coding, if you are having time, if you have a voluntary will, please go ahead and contribute. It is a nice paradigm. It's difficult to believe that millions of people who are just like that volunteers started looking at this code, and we must thank Linus Torvalds for making all this source code available. It caught on very well. People started documenting. See how nice it will be to see for yourself that the operating system is claiming this and it is indeed doing this. The commercial versions also have so many functionalities, but you can't see the code of the operating system. It is a commercial version, you will have to purchase that and then keep it on your machine, and then it works, and you have to believe that the operating system is doing whatever they have claimed. The commercial versions have been claimed. Here you can definitely go ahead, look under the hood. If you are good in operating system internals, you can take a look at the source code. People have done good Linux documentation projects all on a voluntary basis. High quality code. In fact, patches of code are much better than any commercial operating system has ever produced. I mean, any commercial operating system developer has ever produced. On a voluntary basis, some of the code that has come out was so brilliantly written that we keep talking about that code as case studies in regular classrooms, and it beats the quality of many commercial exercises in the area of systems and systems programming. Free software was the name that gradually evolved for those people who started using this code. They might have been volunteers, they might not have been volunteers, they might have participated only in the documentation, limited participation, whatever it is. We must thank Linus Torvalds for making available this exercise of voluntary work on software, a fantastic operating system called Linux there for everybody to use. Free software was thus the first idea that emanated out of how to use this. Free software is software that can be used, studied, modified and copied with little or no restriction. So, we need to understand that this is the definition with which we began, and what we are talking about is that can be used, studied and modified, copied, changed with little or no restriction, and which can be copied and redistributed in modified or unmodified form. This is the concern which we have been having. We said that there should be something called public domain software which should be understood, which began to happen before this open source idea caught on in a completely well packaged, well supported, well documented manner. The public domain software was also giving software pieces which are available, but then nobody was there to stand guard and tell that this is how it is, this is how it works. There were so many hazards. Unlike in what open source was giving, it is a complete live operating system called Linux. As I said, there can be any piece of software that can be developed in this mode. Open Office is one set of pieces of software that came together. We have Word, we have PowerPoint, the open tag was there. So, open source as an idea is very generic. Apache Web Server is an open source software. The idea is that the software is available, it is nicely supported, it is a live software, it keeps on developing, it works, and then if you are knowledgeable enough, you can definitely understand how it is working. We had a practical problem when we got our first Linux installation done. The server was a low end server, and even for 24 nodes it was getting very slow, it was getting bogged down. So, what we could do was we could simply remove the scheduler, modify the scheduler, do it ourselves, notify saying that this is how we should be doing it. A slight adjustment on the scheduler in the OS code which is available made it much faster. Still, the network was slow. 25 years back, the network was slow, things were not happening that fast. It gives you that promise that you can do this, you can use it, you can study this, you can modify, you can copy, you can change with little or no restriction. You can do it for yourself. Not stopping there, if you have a doubt, you please put it on the mail server. By the time you log out, you will get at least a dozen responses saying that this is how you should solve the problem. It was a great synergy of several volunteers, millions of volunteers working on the open source. Free software is available gratis, free of charge in most cases. So, this is the attraction, and it is well supported. As I said, pieces of code in this method are sometimes much better than a commercial grade. In practice, for software to be distributed as free software, the human readable form of the program, the source code must be available. In other cases, it is only an executable, however discounted price it may be, it is still an executable, must be available along with the notice granting the user permission to further adapt the code and continue its redistribution for free. There is no reason to notify to any people, but there is good practice, professional practice. This notice either grants a free software license or releases the source code into the public domain. Please look at this Wikipedia. I would strongly think that you can develop more content in English, readable form. Wikipedia is one such good open exercise that has happened. For everything you find a page, you can have a lot of content, you can understand easily, you can modify, you can participate. That's for human readable form. What we are talking about is a software in a human readable form, that's a source code, which is also very important because you can understand what is happening under the hood. Open software, in the beginning all software was free. There is nothing called cost associated with the software. In the 1960s, when IBM and others sold the first large scale computers, these machines came with software which was free. Nobody ever thought that outside of the hardware and outside of the physical hardware pieces, anything can be costed at all. Is there a cost associated with software? Even today we keep talking about purchasing machines where the software is bundled free. That's a normal parlance. This software could be freely shared among users. The software came written in a programming language, source code available, and it could be improved and modified. Manufacturers were happy that people were writing software that made their machines useful. People were managing themselves. People could write software and tell them, see, I wrote this simple code, now your machine is more useful to me than what it was before. So the idea of software getting some cost factor associated with it didn't happen in the beginning. 1960s it was, when it's hard to believe that an organization like an IBM was giving software just like that. IBM PC clone software, the costing of the software was a later idea. It was the hardware, it's something that we are talking about. Then proprietary software dominated the software landscape as manufacturers removed access to the source code. IBM and others realized that most users could not or did not want to fix their own software. There was money to be made in leasing or licensing software. So after some years, IBM itself said, no, now that is no more free. If you want this piece of software, you pay more money. Leasing, licensing software, these are certain ideas that came later. Software began to become a commercial proposition. By the mid-70s, almost all software was proprietary. The idea of proprietariness on software is a decade later than the very first use of software on commercial machines. And it was very good to have a proprietary software that is owned by an individual. If something goes wrong, who will take the responsibility? There are always major restrictions on its use. Its source code is almost always kept secret. Users were not allowed to redistribute it. It is just once you are licensed to use it. Till today, software licensing is happening. What we need is, if something goes wrong, who will be responsible? That's the question. And what we did was, if you purchase proprietary software, if something goes wrong, we know whom to call, they will come and rectify it. Software development, software engineering gradually began to be understood towards the late 60s and early 70s. 68, 69, the field of software engineering got defined properly through NATO conferences, and what we understood is that whatever we do, whatever principles, concepts, limited number of them are there, we are not able to show a success rate that is even 16 to 20%. Success in terms of development in within the estimated time, development within the estimated cost. These have not happened in that sense of happening, and therefore what we have done is, first things first, we should have that professional responsibility. Tomorrow the brand of IBM should not be dragged for something that was modified in the software which they bundled, and IBM is getting blamed and the brand is getting eroded. The simple solution was, make the software proprietary. All these challenges were surmounted once we started talking about open source, which is a great achievement. Source code is not available, users cannot modify the program, software is an additional product that was for sale. In a sense, open source has given a solution that has virtually put the time clock back into 60s, where software was never thought of as something that can be costed. Gradually we understood that software development process is like this. Till today, after 40-50 years, we are still talking about only 33% success rate. So, what we need to understand is software was not deemed a science, not deemed an engineering discipline, not deemed an art. It is something which has to happen as art, science, discipline and psychology all flowing in together towards this problem solution, and it has become a brand conscious exercise very soon. That is, soon after software engineering got defined and people began to understand what is this software engineering, the brand consciousness began to creep in, and the first things first idea, proprietary software began to rule the roost. All software is proprietary. If anything goes wrong, please call us. Don't try to modify, don't try to change the source code, don't try to solve it yourself. It should be like this. And it began to become more and more expensive. Nobody appreciated also why software should cost so much. In 1980, US copyright law was modified to include software. Software became fully formally copyrightable. So that is when things have become. In late 1970s and early 1980s, two different groups started what became to be known as open source to solve all these problems, which made what was so nice. Software was not costed, software was open, even in commercial machines which were so successful, roaring successes. But then to put the clock back, we needed this idea called open source. East Coast Richard Stallman, formerly a programmer at the MIT AI lab, launched the GNU project and Free Software Foundation. GNU is not Unix, that is what it is. To satisfy the need for and give the benefit of software freedom to computer users, 60s was so great that the machine was a gigantic IBM machine, but what you do with that machine is very much under your control. At all levels, the source is there, open source is there, software was not costed. The ultimate goal of GNU project was to build a free operating system. The GNU GPL, General Public License, was designed. Now the concern here is that Richard Stallman and Free Software Foundation have taken the approach of creating a license called GPL, General Public License, about which we will see later. They are guiding principles. To understand the concept, you should think of free as in free speech. It's a right, not as free beer. It is not costing you, it is not that free beer doesn't cost, it costs. Intangibles are many. A gift also costs. That's how we keep telling. So what we need to understand is free software is a matter of the user's freedom to run, copy, distribute, study, change and improve the software. The freedom to run the program for any purpose, the freedom to study how the program works and adapt it to your needs. Access to the source code is a precondition for this. The idea is good, but then Richard Stallman ensured that the message is driven home. There are three types of freedoms. First freedom is this. Zeroth freedom is to run the program for any purpose. You run the program, if it works, it works. The freedom to study how the program works. The freedom to redistribute copies, the freedom to make it public so that the whole community benefits. These are the simple levels of freedom which Richard Stallman has driven home. There are guiding principles. A program is free if users have all these freedoms. You should also have the freedom to make modifications, but they are governed by a GPL. Free Software Foundation is responsible to have these guidelines driven home, and all the people who were trying to work with pieces of software that were developed by others were being called hackers. Hacker became a very disciplined idea. Hackers were beginning to consider good guys. The impact of Richard Stallman on creating this GNU, General Public License, and what is called Free Software Foundation is people who were called hackers began to be respected. Hacking became a profession of its own. People can simply get in and then say that yes, we acknowledge that this is a code developed by somebody else, but I know programming, I can understand this code, I can build further, I can develop it further. The positive sense of contributing in a voluntary manner has begun to be called hacking, and it became a very good idea. And a counterpart who tries to damage is a cracker. Once you know that somebody is getting paid to become a cracker, the cracker makes sure that the fellow who is paying goes down to the knee level before helping him out. That's how things work. Open source software West Coast, the Computer Science Research Group in the University of California, Berkeley division. So there were two experiments in the US, one on the East Coast, which is Richard Stallman's Free Software Foundation, one on the West Coast, Computer Science Research Group, University of California. A Berkeley distribution of the Unix was so open, it was well known for networking. It had a fantastic BSD, Berkeley software distribution of Unix was exceedingly good on networking capabilities. There were two things that were happening in the US. Unix was initially developed at AT&T employees. This I have already mentioned. Now out of this came the exercise of open source software in Finland, which was a runaway success, and it caps all, it tops all. The open source world improved. In California, Bill Jollitz implemented a version of BSD Unix free of AT&T's copyright. All these things began to be understood very carefully, and as I said, in Finland, Linus Torvalds, a Finnish computer science student, was implementing the first versions of Linux. This capped many. Linux and Linux as an operating system have given way to what is called a completely voluntary, almost no reason to think of licensing. People were so disciplined in a voluntary effort, open source began to happen. This I have mentioned. Open source is a development method for software that harnesses the power of distributed peer review and transparency of the process. There is no other development method anywhere that gives you so much of transparency into the way the software is being developed, improved, tested. Everything about it is transparent. So this is a huge plus of open source, and the operating system that capped it all was Linux, and the man who drove it all was Linus Torvalds from Finland. The promise of open source is better quality. As I said, it is much better at times than commercial grade, higher reliability, more flexibility, but there is nothing to beat this idea of transparency of the process. The process becomes transparency, so we pick up open source for all these reasons. It's a non-profit corporation. OSI is an open source initiative. Open source software, today there are many who believe proprietary software is the only possible model. Even today, there are so many who believe that proprietary software is much better. However, every organization today has something or the other to offer in the open source variety. There are open source pieces, there are proprietary pieces. It is not that one will kill the other, but then the entire exercise of open source is so charmingly transparent that we like to use open source where possible to improve transparency, to improve the quality of the code. We may not have the best of the minds, best of the programmers within an organization. All over the world, wherever there is time to spare, people can chip in. Hacking, thanks to Richard Stallman, became a very, very respectable idea. Why choose proprietary software over open source if something goes wrong? There is no ownership in open source. You will have to depend. Something is not working, maybe somebody would have solved it. You are writing a code, you got stuck, you simply flag a question. Hopefully by the day breaks, next day you have gone to bed. By the time you wake up, you would have a solution on your mailbox. Open source versus proprietary software, so many things are there. It has been compared on so many factors. Please look at it. We talk about commercial software advantages, vendor professional service, easier to adapt in organizations, automated updates, reduced IT support, best product functionality, security, code quality, don't know what to do, IP protection, other, price. So you please understand that on this many parameters over the past several decades, the idea of open source and proprietary software have always been weighed. We still think open source will build better quality software, and also we understand that it improves the transparency in the way the software is being developed. So if our success rate is only 33 to 35%, it doesn't matter. As we progress, we'll improve it. We'll improve the code more easily than in any other method. So this is how we have been talking about, and what we need to understand is therefore a way in which we can move further in taking a decision for yourself. Revolution OS is a 2001 documentary which traces the history of GNU, Linux and open source and free software movement, please do watch this video. It's a great documentary. Richard Stallman and open source, free software, Linux commercials. So there are so many such things. We need to understand this history. I'll skip this slide. There are so many licenses now. The idea of Linux, free and open source software have gelled well together in the past few decades. There is a difference between the free software and open source software. Both use the same license, the GPL, General Public License. However, free software helps users focus on freedom and ethics, but open source software is related to efficiencies gained by the free software approach to development. So free software is like that. The open source definition, open source does not just mean access to source code. The distribution terms of open source software must comply with the following criteria. What are the criteria? Free redistribution. Just because you made some tinkering modification, you cannot charge. The license shall not restrict any party from selling or giving away the software as a component of an aggregate software distribution. The license shall not require a royalty or other fee for such sale. You can simply give it off, you have to. Source code, the program must include source code. The source code must be preferred form in which a programmer will modify the program. They do not modify the executables. They take the source code and modify. Deliberately obfuscated source code is not allowed. You cannot tinker in a manner to spoil the entire goal or the way in which the existing piece of software is working. It's more on the ethics front. You should be an ethical computer programmer. The license must allow modifications in derived works and must allow them to be distributed under the same terms as the license of the original software. Integrity of the author's source code. The license may restrict source code from being distributed in modified form only. No discrimination against persons or groups. No discrimination against fields of endeavor. It can be used in any discipline of work. There is no discrimination. Distribution of license. The rights attached to the program must apply to all to whom the program is redistributed. License must not be specific to a product, it is for the entire exercise. License must not restrict other software. You cannot tell that if you are using this licensed software, you cannot use other software. It should not restrict any other software. License must be technology neutral, and therefore, if you adhere to these 10 principles of general public license, you are extremely happy in the open source world. It can be an operating system, it can be a web server, it can be an office tool, it can be an email package, it can be anything across any technology, anywhere, any discipline. Thank you very much.